The following program is an AETN special presentation. Production of this program has been made possible in part by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Southern Educational Communications Association, and by viewers like you.
Down in this valley of the Cumberland Gap, where Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee converge, a World War II fighter plane is being restored to flying condition. For 50 years, this P-38 Lightning was buried in an icy grave, until it was finally rescued by a team of adventurers. The plane was dug out of the ice, 268 feet below the surface of Greenland, where it crash-landed in 1942, while on its way to fight Hitler's Germany. The recovery expedition was financed and captained by Roy SHOFFNER, a former Air Force fighter pilot who fell in love with a chapter of forgotten history. In SHOFFNER's hangar in Middlesboro, Kentucky, the plane is being rebuilt by hand, piece by piece.
You know, people walk in here in a small town of 9,000 population and see a project of the enormity that we've taken on, the history that we're preserving, and then they'll come up and say, well, why is it here? Why is it in Middlesboro, Kentucky? And I have to say, well, because I'm here.
SHOFFNER has nicknamed his plane Glacier Girl. It was one of 6 fighters and 2 bombers that disappeared while en route to Europe. The squadron flew into a thick fog, ran out of fuel, and was forced to land on the glacier. The pilots and navigators were rescued, but their planes were left behind. P-38 pilot Brad McManus was the first to crash land on the ice cap.
Just come right on in.
Thanks. Wow.
Isn't that something?
I can't believe it.
Oh, yeah.
I just can't believe it, Roy.
It doesn't look like a crush.
More than a half-century later, McManus is the first squadron veteran to see the rebirth of a plane abandoned a lifetime ago.
It's the original engine in there, huh?
Some old
How about that?
part we put.
The final chapter of this historical journey is yet to be written. It is SHOFFNER's goal and McManus's dream to see the plane fly again over Greenland and on to England, retracing the original mission of the Lost Squadron.
That little P-38 is going to roll out of that hangar and take off. It's going to be a big day.
World War II witnessed the emergence of a third dimension in warfare, in which the air became a primary theater of operation in addition to the land and the sea.
Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the buildup of American troops and aircraft in Europe. Even though the war for the United States started in the Pacific, Roosevelt decided the European theater should get priority. This escalation of troops and weapons was known as Operation Bolero. And as part of this operation, B-17 bombers and P-38 fighters began flying in formation to Great Britain, with fueling stops along the way.
It was about 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and things were chaotic. It was really a desperation thing for the British. And I think they just felt we had to get fighters into action over there as quickly as we could.
At 3 in the morning on July 15th, 1942, a squadron of 6 P-38s and 2 B-17s left Greenland, flying over the ice cap and then across the Denmark Strait to Iceland. 90 minutes from its destination, the squadron flew into a mass of clouds at 12,000 feet.
So we turned back and attempted to go back to Greenland and return to the base, only to find out when we reached Greenland that the base that we had left was now also socked in. So that left no alternative, really. We were in the air 8 hours and 20 minutes, We hadn't really seen the surface, either the ocean or the Greenland ice cap, in all of that time. And suddenly, on the left side, the sun was shining and we could see the snow and ice of the Greenland ice cap. And I, at that point, was virtually out of gas. I was the youngest kid in the flight. I had used more gas than the others. And actually, I just said, I'm going in now while I still have control of the airplane. So I dropped down and circled and went in under the cloud.
As McManus began the descent for his emergency landing on the ice, he had to make a quick decision, whether to belly land his fighter or try and touch down using his landing gear. He knew if he could successfully land with the wheels down, the rest of the squadron would do the same, and they could fly their planes back to the war after receiving fuel. It was a courageous gamble and nearly cost McManus his life.
I made my decision right then, I'm going down. Coming down, I dropped my gear, and I leveled off over the ice, and just as the plane landed, the nose gear embedded in the snow, and the plane went over on its back. The first thought I had was, I've been very foolish. You know, I made a big mistake. And then I wasn't hurt, and I was upside down, and I couldn't see anything, and the cockpit began to fill with smoke.
P-38 pilot Bob Wilson watched from the air as McManus crashed and flipped his plane. Instantly, Wilson feared his friend had been killed.
And he rolled for quite a ways. Got slowed down, but when that nose wheel went down, those machine guns and cannons sticking out of the nose were just like the cleat on a football shoe. When that hit the snow, that stopped him dead and flipped him right on his back. And we watched him real close. I was flying beside him. When he flipped, I thought, oh boy, he's gone. And then I saw Brad get out, just stand up. And I thought, wow, that's great.
I was scared. I was afraid it was going to burn. But fortunately, the lack of fuel, that wasn't a risk. So I managed to get the window cranked open. I got my feet up and out and pushed the snow out, came out, tunneled out under the wing. The others who had been watching all of this, they probably figured I'd bought it. And when they saw me crawl out, they started to do loops and slow rolls. So then the others gradually circled in, and with their gear up, they landed like a sled.
The last P-38 to touch down was flown by Lieutenant Harry Smith. He feathered his plane in without power so he wouldn't bend the props. 50 years later, it was Smith's plane that was dug out of the ice, with the propellers still intact.
I come in trying to get as close as possible to the other ships. Cut the gun at 200 feet, off mixture, switched props to feather, hold her off with the props, just turning till she stalls, bump. Snow flies, the old crate slides along, and that's all. Another landing. Didn't even bend the props. Lieutenant Harry Smith, the Lost Squadron.
We were so happy at that point to be on terra firma, to be down again where we could feel the sun and know that we were safe, because we were within 20 minutes of a major disaster, really. We
were going through Iceland. We weren't carrying ammunition in our machine gun bins. We had a lot of personal stuff stacked down in there, and old Spider had put a bunch of whiskey down in his. And when he landed, the tail, both booms broke off. He jumped out of the cockpit and opened up the nose and flipped it up and went, "Thank the Lord I didn't break a bottle," he said. So we had a little emergency whiskey up there.
For 3 days, we sent out an SOS, and no one heard it. The magnetic interference in the north is such that radio signals don't transmit very clearly. And one of the interesting things was that to keep the generator functioning, the mechanics sawed the propeller off the number 3 engine on the B-17 so that it could spin and keep the generator functioning and charge the battery. So for 3 days, we sent out a radio message, and on the 3rd day, they heard it.
The squadron's SOS signals were received by an American weather station on the east coast of Greenland. When the men learned they would be rescued, fear turned to elation.
This is a Kodak camera that my dad gave me just before we left, saying you might run into something interesting. And fortunately, it took about 60 or 80 pictures up on the ice after we landed. We really were a happy group. It was an incredible experience during a period that we didn't know whether we'd make it. But once we knew that, we relaxed.
So they dropped some supplies and parachutes. And we'd get the supplies out and set on the burlap bag, and there's always a wind up there. And we'd flip the cords on the chute, and we set on the bag and ride it like a sled across the ice cap. One old kid rode so long, took him all day to get back.
And on the 10th day, they came on the horizon. We could see the dog teams coming toward us. And we had visions that we would ride out on sleds. And as it turned out, when the dogs arrived, they weren't much bigger than Chihuahuas, it seemed. They were very small. And we realized then that, we were going to walk out the hard way.
You'd step on the snow and it'd give about 3 inches, and there was an ice layer. And then when you get your full weight on, it'd drop another 3 inches. Just jolt every step. We started out carrying our personal belongings, and all along the trail here was this cast off, that was cast off. It got heavier and heavier. I remember one time I was so tired, and I laid down in the snow, and I began to feel warm. And somewhere something clicked that I had read that if you felt warm and extreme cold, you better get moving. So I got up and kept moving.
After trudging across the glacier for 17 miles, the exhausted men reached the shore. They boarded a Coast Guard cutter and were shipped back to the States and given new assignments. For the Lost Squadron, this adventure was over, but new ones would follow. The war would rage on for another 3 years, and they would all re-enter the fighting.
And we went back to the West Coast, formed a new P-38 group, and eventually took that back to England a year later. Most of us had truly forgotten this incident. It just merged with a lot of other World War II things that we all did.
The Army Air Force never went back to recover the planes from the Lost Squadron. Decades of ice and snow blew across the tundra of the Greenland ice cap and encased the bombers and fighters in a glacier hundreds of feet below the surface. For nearly half a century, the airmen would continue to tell their stories, but their planes were believed lost forever, trapped in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. Treasure hunters and World War II enthusiasts were intrigued by the possibility of recovering the planes, since they were almost new when abandoned on the ice cap. In 1983, the aircraft were located by radar.
And they had originally thought that these planes would be sitting there on the surface, and they simply clear the snow off and fly them out. But as it turned out, they were 263 feet below the surface of the Greenland ice cap.
In 1990, a group known as the Greenland Expedition Society melted down to a B-17, hoping to pull the bomber out of the ice, but the plane was too crushed to salvage. 2 years later, a new expedition was financed by Kentucky businessman Roy SHOFFNER. It was the 13th and final mission to rescue a plane from the Lost Squadron. This time, the goal was to recover a P-38. Since the fighters were covered with stronger armor than the bombers, it was hoped that this armor might have protected the planes from the pressures of the ice.
My beginning with it was to be a financier of the project. Of course, when you loan money, you have to watch it, and I didn't want to see it go down an ice hole, so I went with it, and to be there when they started the expedition on the ice cap. We did camp out in tents, and there was a lot of wind and a lot of snow, and we did put down a piece of plywood as a floor and attached our tent to it, and there were times when the wind raised them up and let them back down. And when you get into a 50, 60, 70 knot situation, you were subject to be blown away with the tent. But yeah, no, we never were scared about it. It seemed like we were always in charge of our own destiny, and we were going right for the object that we had come for.
To bore through the ice and reach a P-38, the expedition used a super gopher, a giant heated cone that melted the ice and pumped water back to the surface. In less than 1 month, the gopher melted a 268-foot tunnel straight down to the plane. Hot water hoses were then used to melt an under-ice cave that revealed a surprisingly intact fork-tailed devil, the one Harry Smith feathered in to save the propellers.
To look down and swing over that hole of 268 feet that looked like a soda straw and took 25 minutes to go down, it was not a place for somebody that did not like tight places, but we had a string of lights that went down through there, and we had cables and wires and chains to keep separated so we could have clear passage down. The first funny feeling I had was when we got there, there was water covering the surface of the airplane, and I could feel it with the cleats on the bottom of my shoes standing in about 6 inches of water. And we called the surface to turn on a pump to lower the water level, and then we could begin to see the rest of the airplane. And then we decided that it was not totally destroyed, that it should be rebuildable, and we would take it apart and bring it out.
My first feeling when I got down to the plane after coming through that 4-foot diameter hole, and I saw how big the plane was, it was a very sickening feeling. I said, how in the world are we going to get this plane up that little hole? We were just inventing on a daily basis how to do this thing.
Down in the cavern, the plane was disassembled, frozen together for half a century. The parts had to be carefully pried apart and then pulled up through the narrow shaft to the surface. Shortly before noon on July 15, 1992, 50 years to the moment that 24-year-old Lieutenant Brad McManus crash-landed his plane on the ice with his wheels down, 74-year-old Brad McManus returned to the ice cap as the guest of the recovery team. Surrounded by pieces of his late friend Harry Smith's P-38, an emotional McManus took part in a ceremony that included the firing of a 20-millimeter cannon that had been pulled from the plane.
3, 2, 1.
And to the very day, and the very hour, and the very minute that we crashed, we were standing on that ice cap. And there was that airplane We had a service there. They sang God Bless America. Someone did the 23rd Psalm. And each of us that had something to say talked. It was quite a very moving experience.
It took 4 months to recover the parts of the P-38. The 7,000-pound center section was the most difficult to get out of the hole. Once it had been pulled to the surface, a helicopter was brought in, and with a makeshift sling, the chopper carried the center section off the ice cap. The dismantled wreckage was eventually shipped to Roy Shoffner's private hangar in the Cumberland Gap.
Put this where it's supposed to go.
In January 1993, the slow process of rebuilding the airplane began. To manage the restoration, Shoffner hired Bob Carden, the Vietnam vet he had empowered to get his plane off the ice.
First of all, we did recover a complete airplane, with the exception of 3 fuel caps, so at least we knew we had all the pieces. And we got the plane back here. What our plan was, we'd just take it apart until we didn't find any more broken pieces, and then from there we'd go back together. Well, after we took off all the broken pieces, we had nothing left. And we didn't know it at the time, but we went to Greenland and recovered a P-38, but it was a very early model P-38, and it was not the same model that was in production at the end of the war, so therefore the parts that are available didn't work on this particular model of plane. Our plan or our goal is to restore the airplane back to exactly the same condition it was when it left the factory in 1942. We are going to make the airplane 100% authentic. We've had to do a lot of searching and a lot of manufacturing of parts. The plane, when it's finished, will be approximately 80% original. In other words, we've been able to save 80% of the pieces of the plane. We were able to purchase from the Smithsonian Institute a complete set of the drawings for the P-38, and we found out that each piece of the plane had a number and it corresponded to a drawing, and we've been able to use those drawings to ensure each piece that we were either fixing or making was right up to the specs.
We found a lot of graffiti on the inside of the airplane that the factory workers had left. Here we have, it says, aft boom installed by Rogers and Kirkpatrick, and it has their employee numbers, and they work the swing shift. And then here we have a little Japanese guy with horns and great big ears, and everything he hears, he's writing on this little scroll tablet, you know.
Where were you flying out of?
I flew out of 306 Bomb Group in Bedford, England.
The restoration is a living, working museum. Many visitors are World War II veterans who have been following the story of the Lost Squadron since 1942. Some of the most passionate guests are former P-38 pilots who get the chance to touch and feel a lightning for the first time since their glory days as fighter aces.
Well, these guys just lost and didn't know where they were.
Every time we've had a World War II pilot come in here, I talk with them and explain to them what we're doing, and I have at least 75 bullets now signed by World War II P-38 pilots or crewmen you know, those guys had to have been pretty lucky to survive the war, so we're going to make a bandolier for each one of the machine guns, and when we fly the airplane for the first time, we'll take all their signatures and their good luck, put in the machine guns, and let them come with us.
Good deal.
It's rather gratifying to see the veterans come in and see their reaction to it. You know, they leave saying thank you for the memories.
Of all the planes in World War II, the one with the greatest following is the P-38. I can't explain why, except the guys that flew it loved the plane. It was a great airplane.
Of the more than 10,000 P-38s built during the war years, only 6 are still flying. The plan is to make Glacier Girl the 7th. At first, she will be flown in air shows. And later, the men who dug her out of the ice plan to fly this Lightning to Europe, following the route originally charted for the Lost Squadron.
We went to the ice cap to recover an airplane and we came back with an artifact. And it's true. We have the only P-38F in the world. It's the only one. And we have a responsibility to our children and our grandchildren to make it right and make it go. It's our goal to finish the mission that she started in 1942. We want to fly the airplane to England along the original route. And wheels down in England, I think, will be the end of the story. Or maybe the start of another one, who knows?
Production of this program has been made possible in part by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Southern Educational Communications Association, and by viewers like you. For more information about the P-38 Restoration Project, write The Lost Squadron Museum, Post Office Box 776, Middlesboro, Kentucky 40965, or call 606-248-1149.